Weekend. Memorial Day gives us, as we said earlier, the opportunity to reflect on those who have sacrificed their lives for our freedom in this country. Many of you, because of its proximity, have undoubtedly stood out at Fort Custer, as Pastor Steve and I had the opportunity to do just this week, where military and their families are buried. Some of you perhaps have been to Arlington National Cemetery, where again, many from our nation's history who have given their lives and others who have served and died are buried. The most sobering experience along that realm that I've had was in the Philippines. Outside of Manila, there is a huge American cemetery. And standing there and realizing that these aren't just service people who have died, most of them were men and women who died in battle in the course of World War II. And seeing row after row after row of those crosses and thinking about the sacrifices that were made for us and our freedom. And the reality is, though we have veterans of Korea and the Gulf War and Afghanistan and other things that continue on, unfortunately wars continue, that generation, that World War II generation, is very quickly fading from the scene. And if you're one of those veterans, I encourage you to talk to your family about that experience and the cost of war. It's important for us to remember those kinds of things. Several years ago, my father had the opportunity to do one of the honor flights where they flew him along with many other veterans into Washington, D.C. to see especially the World War II memorial there, reminding all of us of the sacrifices. And as I thought about this Memorial Day weekend, I thought it would be good for us not to hear from one of the World War II generation, but to hear from a veteran of war long before that. His name is Joshua. And Joshua was involved, as most of you know, in the conquest of the land of Israel. And our text this morning is in Joshua 23, and it tells us that Joshua is nearing the end of his life. In fact, he says, "I'm old and well advanced in years." He's probably about 110 at this point. We'd probably all agree that's old and advanced in years. And he calls together the heads of the nation of Israel. In chapter 24, he's going to call the whole nation together. But here it is especially the leadership, because he's concerned. It's a time of transition. Joshua himself had lived through the transition from Moses and wandering in the wilderness to being in the land and fighting war. But now his generation is about to pass off the scene, and another transition is going to occur. And as he looks around, he's concerned about what he sees. Maybe as some of our World War II veterans may look around and be concerned with what they see. And he says to the people, "Remember," which is interesting because if you know the early history of Israel, that was a key word that Moses used before he passed off the scene. And now Joshua wants his nation to remember some things. And I think the truths that he shares with them are also significant for you and for me to remember. To remember as Americans on this Memorial Day weekend. And to remember as followers of Christ as well. The first thing that Joshua says to us is that he wants us to remember that victory and security come from God alone. And in this first truth, he's really focusing past. He's thinking back for the most part. And he says to us and to them, it is important that we understand what God did for us. Because the danger is, for Israel and for us, that when we become comfortable and we become prosperous, that we begin to think that somehow we accomplished what we have. We're kind of like the woodpecker, and we have some of those outside our house. I hear them in the mornings. Maybe you do too. And he was out there pecking away at a tree one day, and suddenly a bolt of lightning came down and split the tree, knocked the woodpecker back off the tree. And he was kind of dazed for a minute, and then when he came to, he looked up at this split tree, and he said, "Wow, look what I did." And that happens for us. We look around at our country. We look at the freedoms that we enjoy, the prosperity that we have, and we say, look at what we have accomplished. And Joshua says, remember, victory and security come from God alone. Any past victories come from God. And we can look and we say, well, there was human effort. Absolutely. You read the book of Joshua, there was human effort. Men sacrificed, men died, and that's true in our nation's history. But ultimately, undergirding that is the sovereign hand of God. And if He doesn't give victory, if He doesn't provide security, there is none. And Joshua says to his nation and to us in verse 3, "And you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake. For it is the Lord your God who has fought for you." You've seen what God has done. You've seen how God has fought on your behalf. God had allowed them nations. Joshua is saying, in essence, it wasn't me. I didn't do this. God did. It wasn't you. You didn't do this. I did. And sometimes that's a little more obvious. You go back to, when they walked around it 6 times or once a day for 6 days and then walked around 7 times on the 7th day and the walls fell down. Everybody says, well, that was God. But then they forget other times victory was God. And if you and I look back in the history of our country, or we look around in our country today, and we say, wow, aren't we something, and we neglect God, we're in dangerous territory. Joshua says here, you have seen this. You were eyewitnesses to it. Don't forget that God did this for your sake. It was His grace. It was undeserved to you. Go on and notice what he says in verse 5. "The Lord your God will push them back before you and drive them out of your sight, and you shall possess their land just as the Lord your God promised you." The promises of God. That's what guarantees future victories. Any future victories will also come from God. That doesn't mean, as it didn't mean for Israel, that we simply sit back and say, okay, God, do your thing. But it means that when we step out to do anything in battle or in daily life, we have to say, God, I can't do this. I need your help. You come and you give me that victory. See, Joshua is dying, and he knows there's still work to be done. There are areas still within the land that's been conquered that need to be finally conquered. The enemy needs to be mopped up. And Joshua knows the key to that is the promises of God. That any future victories will come from God. And that's important for you and me to grab a hold of on this Memorial Day weekend, to remember. Because as I look around our country, sometimes as I look inside my own heart, I'm concerned that as a nation we've become arrogant. That we've become people who rely on our own strength and think that we can then thumb our noses at God without consequence. This nation, this United States of America, did not come into existence by accident or by our great power. In fact, if you know anything about the Revolutionary War, you know it's amazing that we ever won our independence. Maybe one of the most famous paintings from American history is this painting of George Washington kneeling in the snow at Valley Forge. A reminder that Washington understood, as many, maybe most leaders that victory was not going to come by the might of arms against the mightiest empire that the world knew in that day. In fact, one of the love from American history is the story of Washington's escape from New York City. The year was 1776, the year of our announced independence. It was August. And Washington, with 8,000 poorly trained colonial forces, was virtually surrounded by 20,000 British well-trained regulars under the command of General Howe. Washington and his men were simply waiting for Howe to close the noose and to launch the final battle, and it would have ended the war. It would have wiped out any hope. And yet Howe delayed. Inexplicably, he delayed. Perhaps he was waiting for the British fleet to sail up the East River, which would complete the encircling of Washington and his army. But rain and a northeast wind prevented the fleet from sailing up the river. What a coincidence, huh? That's what we would say today. Not a coincidence. Realizing that time was running out, Washington came up with a desperate plan. Move his troops across the river by boat at night. They didn't have that. It was going to take all night and more. And so, very quietly, leaving some men out to fool the British, they began to transport the troops across the East River. The water was choppy at first, and then it calmed some, but as the boatsmen were taking the troops across, they could see dawn was coming, and the troops were across. And they were well within range of the cannons from the British ships and the British forces. And just as dawn would arise, a heavy fog settled in over the river. And every one of the soldiers, including Washington, who was one of the last, made it across the river, and no sooner had they gotten across than the fog lifted. See, that is not an accident. That is divine providence. That is God at work. And our early leaders even recognized that. But later, the war for independence having been won, the colonies were meeting, trying to hammer out what this new nation would look like, and they were not coming to much agreement about a constitution. And in 1777, Benjamin Franklin stood up. This is what he said to those men, and I want you to think about it, especially in light of the story I just told you about New York City. He said, "In the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, daily prayers for divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in the struggle observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor, like wind and rain and fog. Have we now forgotten this power? We imagine we no longer need his assistance. I have lived, sir, a long time. I want to remind you, Franklin was not a believer. He didn't believe in Jesus. He understood that God rules in the affairs of men. I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of man. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings, that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that I firmly believe it. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessing on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning. Nations rise without the power of God, and victory and security come from God alone. And this nation doesn't continue to this day because of greatness. It continues because of the grace of God, which we never deserved, and we probably deserve less today than we ever have. As individuals, remember that as well. Because sometimes when we've accepted Christ, we've been believers for a while, we begin to think that, we were pretty good, that God picked us because we were pretty good people. And we need to remember that it's all the grace of God. And we need to go back to the cross and remember what my sin and your sin cost. And we need to humble ourselves and say, you know what, any victory and any security, any accomplishments in my individual life must also come from God alone. And it's critical that we remember that. Because if we forget that victory comes from God, we will forget the second thing, the second truth that Joshua reminds us of. We need to remember that obedience is essential for victory. See, Joshua looks back and he says, look what God has done. And now he takes the present and he says, and this is what you need to do. This is what we need to do. Because if victory is going to continue, then we obey God. We are responsible to obey his commands now. And Joshua reminds us that obedience is the opposite of complacency. Because you see, Joshua looked around his nation and he saw a lot of people who were very complacent about the situation they were in. You can look around the United States and obedience to God, reverence for God, there's a lot of complacency, if not downright hostility to as well. Joshua says these words in back up. In verse 23, verse 6. Notice with me what Joshua says there. Therefore, be very strong to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, turning aside from it neither to the right hand nor to the left. If that sounds familiar to you, it should. It's almost word for word what Joshua was told in chapter 1, verse 7, as he began his ministry. And now he relates that on to these folks because he's the leader that is passing off the scene. He says, be strong, be steadfast in your obedience, and obey all of the law, not this law and that law, not selectively. All. Don't turn aside from death. Isn't it interesting? He doesn't devote his time to talking military strategy. Now, you 3 tribes, you need to band together and fight the enemy in your territory. And you 2 tribes, you get together and fight this enemy. He says, no, what you need to do is obey God. If you obey God, victory will come. But he warns them that they have become complacent. Because he's been almost 20 years, maybe a little more than 20 years, since Joshua had finished the main conquest. And yet the nations have sat back. The tribes have sat back. And they haven't attacked and finished the conquest. And he knows as in verses 7 and 8, he talks about it. He talks about the compromise that they could be engaged in. He says, don't mix with these nations remaining among you, or make mention of the names of their gods. That doesn't mean you say their name. It really means to call on them in prayer, or swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them. But you shall cling to the Lord your God, just as you have done to this day. He says, be glued to God. Be obedient. That will bring victory. And then he goes on and he says, for the Lord has driven out, he goes back again, he's driven out from before you great and strong nations. And as for you, no man has been able to stand before you to this day. One man of you puts 1,000 to flight, since it is the Lord your God who fights for you, just as he promised you. And then here comes the admonition again. Be very careful, therefore, to love the Lord your God. And the idea of love there being equated with obedience. Jesus himself said, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. And so he challenges them to this exclusive relationship with God. to an exclusive relationship of obedience to God. Because it's only through obedience that they gain victory. And it's only through obedience that they will escape judgment. Joshua is concerned, he's already said it, that they will turn away, that they will intermarry, that they will worship false gods. And he continues on with that theme. He says, this is what will happen if you do that. For if you turn back and instead of clinging to God, being glued to God, you're glued to the remnant of these nations among you. And you make marriages with them so that you associate them and they with you. Then know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations from before you. The only way to avoid the chastening of God is to obey. But they shall be a snare and a trap for you. They will trip you up. They will catch you. There'll be a whip to your sides. And this last one just makes me shudder. And thorns in your eyes. I wear contact lenses. And I know what it's like when I get an eyelash underneath one of those lenses. Oh, I can't imagine a thorn. And yet, what they're going to be if you compromise and you don't obey until you perish from off this good ground that the Lord your God has given to you. He says, you will lose the land if you don't obey. And I have to wonder, as I look over American history in recent days, and I look at some of our ongoing frustrations, what's happening in the Middle East, and the sacrifices that our military made that now have been lost again. I have to wonder if that's not God saying, hey, America, wake up. Doesn't matter how many smart bombs you have. Doesn't matter how much equipment you have, how strong your Navy is, how strong your Air Force is, how strong your ground forces are. Doesn't matter how many missiles you have. If you disobey me, judgment will come. And Joshua wants us to remember that obedience is essential for victory. That's true for us as a nation. That's true for us as individuals. Because the greatest danger for you and me is not just being overwhelmed by the secular world around us, it's surrendering to it. The greatest danger for us, as it was for them, is thinking that we can find truth and direction for life in someone other than God and His Word. For thinking that Canaan or the culture will direct our life. Remember, Israel was coming into this land, and these were the sophisticated, these were the beautiful people in Canaan. At least that's what Israel would have thought. They'd been slaves. They'd been wandering in the desert, and here are these magnificent cities and cultures. Well, maybe we have a lot to learn from them, and God says, you have nothing from them in terms of morality and how to live your life. Learn from me. Third and final reminder that Joshua gives to us is tied back to that second one. Because Joshua wants us to remember that God is faithful. When he talked about what God has done in giving victory and security, especially focused in the past. When he talked about obedience, he said, this is what you need right now. And now he looks down the road and he says, and you need to understand as you move into a future, and for Israel it was going to be a future without Joshua, you need to understand and remember that God is faithful, that He keeps His word. We've already seen that theme. It's resonated throughout this passage, but now He really drives it home. And He says, God's faithful in blessing obedience. Again, we've seen that theme, but He again wants them to understand God has kept and will keep His promises. Look at what Joshua says in verse 14. And now I'm about to go the way of all the earth. And you know, he says, in your hearts and souls, all of you know this, that not one word has failed of all the good things that the Lord your God promised concerning you. All have come to pass for you. Not one of them has failed. You know, he says that kind of 3 times in one verse. You get the idea. He thinks this is significant. God's faithful. And in his faithfulness, God has blessed your obedience. But then he goes on to warn them and to warn us that if you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God and go and serve other gods and bow down to them, then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and you shall perish quickly from off the good land that he has given to you. And all you have to do is look at Israel's history, and that happened. In fact, all you have to do is turn a couple of pages over in your Bible to the book of Judges. And you see that Israel didn't obey, and they ended up in bondage to other nations. And then you turn a few more books further, and you see Israel again after Solomon, under Rehoboam, and the kings that followed, disobeying God to the point where finally in 586 BC, Babylon sweeps in, and the nation of Israel ceases to exist for a few hundred years. And then they're reestablished, and God comes to them in the flesh. Jesus comes, and he walks among them, and they say, we won't have this man to rule over us. We're going to do our own thing. And they crucify him. And in 70 AD, Rome comes and ends the nation of Israel as a nation until our modern era. And the words of Joshua came about. He said, God is faithful. He is faithful to bless you, and he's faithful in judging disobedience. He will judge if you do not obey. You can lose the land, and they did. And that's an important reminder for us. We must remember that God is faithful to bless, and he's faithful to judge, to punish. And because of that, you and I who are followers of Christ need to say, God, help me to walk in fellowship with you. Help me to confess my sins, because you are faithful to forgive my sins. And individually, we need to make sure we're in fellowship with God. Because Hebrews tells us, whom the Lord loves, he chastens and scourges every son whom he receives. Punishment will come to followers of Christ who walk away from him. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week. But if we don't turn and walk back to him, he will punish us to turn us around. It's also true of a nation. God rules, Franklin said, in the affairs of man. It is not just Israel, though Israel was his special people. God rules all nations. And the Old Testament records that. It records God rules Babylon. And so Nebuchadnezzar has the dreams and all the things that happen because God is king over all. And as American citizens, that should cause us to soberly pray for our nation. Because we are not in obedience to God in most areas of life as a country. Thomas Jefferson was also not a believer. In fact, if you know anything about Jefferson, you know he tried to create his own New Testament where he took all the miraculous out of it. But Jefferson did say, the God who gave us life gave us liberty. Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed a conviction that these liberties are the gift of God? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever. Sobering words. A reminder that we need to pray for our nation, and a reminder that you and I who are followers of Christ need to live out the truths of our faith. If you were to summarize Joshua's words, he would just simply tell us that there is no victory, there is no security except what comes from God. So we need to obey him, and we need to rest in his faithfulness. And that's critical for us as believers. As we see a country that turns further and further away from God, unless God sends revival, it's going to be critical that we rest in his faithfulness, because God is going to bring suffering to us and perhaps judgment to our country. Richard Halverson was the chaplain for the United States Senate for many years. And he makes this statement: we have become technological giants and spiritual and moral dwarfs. We are sophisticated in scientific progress and primitive in spiritual development. We live as though man is the center of the universe and God is a peripheral invention of pious enthusiasts. We are abundantly rich in material resources, minimally poor in spiritual and moral capital. That's sobering. And that's a call for us to pray. On this Memorial Day weekend, if you leave here with nothing else, I'd like you to leave here saying, you know what, I need to pray faithfully for our nation. President Abraham Lincoln makes almost the same statement as Halverson. Maybe it was in Halverson's mind as he wrote his words. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God who made us. We have grown in numbers, wealth, and power as no other nation has grown, but we have forgotten the gracious hand that preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. We have vainly imagined that some superior virtue and wisdom produced all these blessings. It behooves us then to humble ourselves, to confess our national sins, and to pray for clemency and forgiveness. March 1863, but it could have been written in 2015 because it applies. And it reminds us of our need for God alone. Let's pray. Father, we have been looking at your word, and we have been reminded of truths that were just as true for Joshua as they are for us. We've been reminded of the sobering fact that nations exist only by your sovereign plan, and that you bring blessing on nations which obey, and you bring judgment on nations which disobey. And Lord, you don't always on our timetable, but you are holy and just. And so, Father, as we think about this, we, with Jefferson, would say we tremble for our nation when we see the direction that we're headed. And Lord, those of us in this, we don't have a lot of influence. We don't have a lot of power as the world measures those things. But you have given those of us who are your children the ability, by your grace and because of the Spirit's presence within us, to live out Christ-likeness as a witness to those around us. So, Father, help us to do that. Help us to be salt and light in a culture that is becoming more corrupt and increasingly dark. Help us to pray for our nation. You have said that the prayers of righteous people are effective. And so it is our prayer that you would give us grace that we don't deserve longer, and that by your grace you might bring a revival that we don't deserve to this country. And that it might begin in my heart, in the hearts of your people, so that we influence others to understand that ultimately you are the only foundation, and that salvation comes through Jesus Christ alone and no other. It's in his name we pray.